I keep looking up at this clock here, and I still got 5 minutes, but I got a feeling that one is not on time. So we'll get this Special Environment Committee meeting underway. The call to order. 7th day of October 2020. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional territory, that's the name of First Nation. And the first order of business is to adopt the agenda. And just for the public to know that this meeting is live streamed and will also be video recorded. So could I get somebody to move the agenda? Go for it, Elise. Moved by Jerome, seconded by Elise. All in favor? And carried. Adoption of the minutes. The minutes for held July 15th be adopted. Moved by Jerome, seconded by, go for it, Elise, or Darren, Lindsay, Elise, all in favor, carried. Okay, on to reports. Reimagine Nanaimo Climate Action Environmental Technical Backgrounders, and this was to be introduced by Singh.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm sorry, just trying to hygienically change. I think I failed there. Thank you for having us here. I'm part of the Reimagine team, the integrated team of staff leading the Reimagine process, which, of course, an important part is the environmental aspects related to climate change and adaptation. And so what you're going to hear from today is from Rob Lawrence, who is our staff person and expert on climate change internally, and then also our consultants who are Lanark and also Duncan from C2MP, going through the technical backgrounders on climate and hazard adaptation, GHG, mitigation, and green infrastructure nature. And the important piece here is, and I want to emphasize that as this committee, you're a really important part of giving feedback to this aspect of the Reimagine process, which includes the official community plan. And what we're hoping to see is all these different aspects of climate change, adaptation, and green infrastructure embedded throughout the document. Some of you who are familiar with our official community plan know that it does already speak to climate change. However, so much has changed since 2008. And these technical backgrounders give us the framework to start looking at what needs to change in that document and other strategic documents, including our Parks, Recreation, and Culture Master Plan, water supply strategy. So without further ado, Rob, over to you. I think you're going to say a few words before Dave.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lisa. It's really just to kind of highlight the specific backgrounders, and I think Dave will speak to this a little bit more. They're really going to be fundamental in the next phase of the Reimagine process, and it's really focused on a higher technical level for stakeholder engagement and staff and other parties that need to be focused on these particular issues, and how we can kind of trade basically choices about what we can do as far as meeting our climate emergency target, for example, or what we can do on the building front, the transportation front to lower emissions, but also look at adaptation. And we have recently passed an adaptation strategy, and there's a number of recommendations and actions, but the technical backgrounders provide more detail on more specifics that drill down a little bit further on what we could be looking at and considering. So the hope is you've had a chance to look at these even on a high level, and we can have a little bit of a discussion and answer questions and maybe hear your comments about some of those details that are laid out in the technical backgrounders. and some of the choices that we might be seeing emerging out of those reports. So that's generally what I see as kind of the discussion focusing on. So Dave, I don't know, is there anything you want to add on your end?
Just on muting. No, not at this point. I'll get into it in the presentation, but I believe Councillor Brown and Gesselbrock are on the agenda first. Is that right?
Oh, yes. But I guess we were just finishing off our introduction to the technical backgrounders, which is first on the agenda. But that's fine.
Yes. I think I'll just say that council and the public have seen the public-facing backgrounders that are out there, and that provide high-level information to support public process and the survey that's going around and that's online. Just apologize maybe a little bit that the technical backgrounders that are in front of this committee are much more dry than those. They're aimed at a quite technical audience. But there will be those in the committee and then the public and council that are looking for that level of depth and detail. The two go together, they're complementary. And there's all kinds of ideas that are in here. We're in the gap stage. You know, what are the gaps in the NIMO? What are ideas? We're gathering ideas. And so these backgrounders are a collection of ideas. Not all of them will be appropriate for NIMO. Some might be immediate priorities. Some might be down the road a bit. They might spread out over 40 years. But they are a list of what others in the Pacific Northwest and similar jurisdictions are doing right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Maybe questions or comments from the committee?
For sure. So just to clarify, so from this report, are we looking for feedback on the technical backgrounders right now, or is David going to be going through it a bit more in depth?
Yeah.
In his slide presentation?
Exactly, as Dave alluded to, his presentation is really going to touch on a lot of what's in these technical backgrounders. They're there to look at and review, but I think the comments and questions are probably better suited for the presentation later. But this is where the meat of the matter is basically in these documents.
Okay, so before I go to questions, just to clarify then, over what period can we provide feedback to these technical backgrounders, and before, like, at what point will they be disseminated, or have they already been disseminated to various stakeholders and previous ones?
They're still draft. They're being circulated internally. I'm thinking, like, unless Dave or Lisa has anything else to add, I'm thinking that by the start of November, early November.
Okay. Just
That's
curious.
exactly what I would have said, yes. End of the month.
Okay. Great. So yeah, we'll have a couple chances to provide feedback on this in this meeting, but yeah, questions, feedback right now. Jerome, I saw you had your hand up there.
Yeah, I think it's a follow-up to your question, just so I'm clear. These technical backgrounders, are these essentially options that you would consider or that could be implemented in some fashion in the NIMO, or are these basically the guiding principles you're already using to craft the strategy or whatever comes out of the plan?
They are the former. They're options. They're simply a list of options. They're not intended to be anywhere near recommendations. They're just a list of options to think about.
So it's essentially you want to use, I mean, combining that with the survey responses, and you're trying to sort of craft something out of those existing structures or documents or strategies.
Correct. And of course, this is the environment and climate change topic. There are social topics and recreation and on and on and on. This is a menu, if you like, to think about. No more than that.
Thank you. And one last little comment. It would be great if we could get these with a little bit more lead time, because, you know, like the vast majority of these have pretty extensive links to other documents, and if you start going down those rabbit holes, 4 days is not enough to really get an idea, right? So it would be great if we could have a bit more time on those.
Just to respond briefly, yeah, Jerome, comments can be received until the end of the month, so there's definitely plenty of time.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I definitely would invite, yeah, if if you have comments and feedback on this material, to please send it to staff and CC the chairs as well, so that we can have a look
Okay.
at it. And that would be greatly appreciated. Any other questions? Just looking at hands up. Elise, did you have something? Nope. Okay. I had a couple comments on this. One, just looking at the section sort of briefly mentioned in waste, and a lot of times sort of there's a sectoral analysis of greenhouse gas emissions sort of by, waste, buildings, transportations, and then there's been some interesting documentation on sort of systemic analysis that looks at the amount of carbon emissions resulting from the supply provision of goods or from food. And from that analysis, like just looking at solid waste management policies, sort of circular economy policies to sort of reduce consumption or shift consumption, looks like there's potential for greenhouse gas emission reduction gains. And I'm just curious, I think that section could be given a bit more meat and options in there. I don't know if I saw, like, for example, like the city of Victoria's got a strategy on the zero waste strategy, and within that, sort of leveraging municipal tools around green buildings bylaw, sort of construction demolition bylaw on deconstruction. Reusing the different materials in deconstruction, and then we're already working on policies around social procurement and sustainable procurement. So I don't know how that fits into the OCP process. But even looking at land use planning around being able to enable sort of the emergence of certain types of industries, I'm not sure the suite of what's available in that area, but I think that would be something that I'd love to see a bit more flushed out.
Thank you. Yeah, good comments.
I guess the other thing I was curious about too is like, say specific, right now there's the technical briefings of particular policies that we could pursue, and definitely quite surprised looking at the impact of GHGs on building emission and fuel type, and sort of the lack of progress we've made basically through the promotion of natural gas to heat homes, and that the statements in there that basically we could have this step code 5 in there, and it's not going to make as much of a difference if we're still using natural gas. And so I'm curious, like where Berkeley is putting a ban on natural gas in new builds, sort of where within our jurisdictional authority does that sit, and is that something that we can seriously consider? Because out of all of them in there, that kind of seemed like the most logical policy direction, and I'm just curious, sort of, at what point are we making those decisions?
I think, well, we'd have to do a little homework on our legislative limits as a local government, what we can control. Definitely the province has a role in providing fuel and energy to communities, and I think they have the jurisdiction. That's something we can follow up on.
That would be great to get more information on that. I guess I have a few other comments on more specific things, and I'm not quite sure, where the appropriate spot to fit that in. So I think maybe we'll proceed. Is there any more questions or comments from the committee? Okay. We'll staff. We'll proceed on to the next item, and then kind of link back into this conversation with David's presentation. So, item 7B, the Environmental Responsibility Framework. So, this is a presentation that Councillor Brown and myself put together, and Rob has put together a bit of a background, or so. I don't know if you wanted to introduce this, Rob.
Sure, of course. So obviously the committees, we've had some discussions earlier about environmental frameworks, and given all the programs, policies, actions the city has been done to have some kind of a way to manage and assess really how we, as the city is progressing on some key environmental priorities for the community, and whether that's reflected in the official community plan or the council strategic plan. We've had a lot of conversation and discussion about having a framework where the public can easily kind of understand where the city is at on these priority areas. So we have met and initially put together an initial draft framework that is online, and it does tie a lot of our current programs, policies to the framework as a reference point for the public to access and learn more about some of those initiatives. But I know the committee, and I know the councillors have also had questions about things about metrics, about how do we manage and measure how we're progressing on these key points. And the intent of this presentation is really kind of just explore that a bit further and look at some examples, particularly the Doughnut economics framework as maybe a model to look at for Nanaimo, and presentations led by Councillor Gieselbrecht.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Great. So this is something that has been a topic of discussion, and we've been working, putting together a framework, and there's something that is up on the website. And this is part of the larger discussion of the importance of frameworks and what are these frameworks serving for, and to provide vision and direction for us going forward. And basically, a lot of this is stemming from our council strategic priority, environmental responsibility, that we set sort of the beginning of the term. And so, yeah, summed up right now, it says we will protect and enhance Nanaimo's natural environment by looking after the community's biological diversity and adapt the way we live, work, recreate, and move. That's the current strategic priority focus, and the sort of underneath that, one of the focus areas is to take leadership role and focus on our environmental impact and climate change contributions, and our decision making and regional participation. And so this question of taking a leadership role and what that means and what that looks like has sort of been the idea we've been kicking around, and why we think that revisiting and to continue to review sort of the framework that we're operating around for environmental responsibility is important. So, Councillor Brown, having his background in policy and from what I've been reading around other cities and the importance of there's a policy urban planner gentleman named Jonathan P. Rose, and he wrote an interesting book called The Well-Tempered City. And this is a quote from one of his from his book that lays out sort of a plan forward, that the important role that cities play for more sustainable and livable communities. And so I'll read out the quote. Just as an equalizing tuning system permitted 24 different musical scales to integrate and to influence one another for the first time, so cities need a framework to unify their many disparate programs, departments, and aspirations. When a community has a vision and a plan for how to carry it out, and is able to coherently integrate its disparate elements, then it begins to be well-tempered. coherence is essential for cities to thrive. And I think that playing with this idea of how to integrate, these large organizations and within a coherent vision, and then have an alignment to where we're going. It's a constant process and a very complex one. And I think sort of on the larger scale of society, it's been something that I think we've been trying to figure out of like what we're actually trying to accomplish as a country and as a planet now, that we're sort of reaching a scale where our actions are having severe consequences at the basic foundations of the things that we depend on for survival. And as we're seeing in our communities also, on the social end, a bit of an unraveling in these major social challenges. I think there's this movement to really redefine what is our focus as a community, as a society, and what are we trying to achieve, so that our efforts are aligned with that. And frameworks are an important tool to really clearly communicate this vision and this purpose and direction, so that we're all on the same page of the direction that we're going into. And good frameworks, from my experience with them and from what I've seen, and are able to communicate that vision through the ability to be aspirational, and also for the ability to be around like objectives of what are the things that we're trying to achieve, and then also having ways to monitor, are we actually moving in the direction of what we're trying to achieve. And recently there's been work done by an economist, Kate Raworth, that has put together a framework for the planet and for society, for the framework going into the 21st century. And I'm not sure how familiar folks are with this, but she's done a really eloquent job of identifying what are the key items that the challenges that we're facing, and what we need to be paying attention to. And so her model, for better or worse, is called Doughnut economics, and it really is setting the stage of where our economies and our organizations and our cities need to operate, and the limits within. And so she's done this diagram where there's the donut, and on the outer limit of the donut are sort of these key planetary boundaries that we have to operate within to meet the needs of a functioning planet. These boundaries you can see are climate change, so the amount of CO2 the planet can handle, ocean acidification. There's 7 planetary boundaries that we have to make sure our economies are working within, so that we don't collapse key systems that we depend on. So on that outer ring there is a description of them, and you can see on that outer, in the diagram, the areas that we're currently overshooting where we're operating within. And so an obvious one is climate change. So the planetary boundary for climate change is 300, scientists think about 350 parts per million, and we're currently at about 400 parts per million and rising, which is a serious threat. Another key limit is biodiversity loss. So rates of species extinction per million species per year, and the boundary's at most 10, and we're losing about 100 to 1,000 species per year, and it's a worsening trend. Also land conversion, the amount of land that we're losing to forested land and forest covered that we're losing to development. that's providing key oxygenation for the planet and other ecosystem services. And so this outer limit is describing when we're developing our systems what we have to stay within. And then also the inner limit is a social foundation, and those are things like education, social equity, energy, access to housing. That is the lower boundary, the social foundation. What's really nice with this framework is that each of these, within each of these boundaries, each category associated with a target, that is trackable. The issue is that it's at a scale that is difficult to make sense at a city, but it eloquently puts into one image the environmental limits that we have to operate in and the social limits that we have to operate in to run a well-functioning society that can persist healthily. And so the city of Amsterdam has been working on how to bring this framework down to the level of a city. And the question they asked is, how can our city be a home to a thriving people and a thriving place while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? So those are the environmental and the social limits. And they've split it up sort of the local and global, and then the social and ecological. And they're currently figuring out what are the targets and indicators that they're trying to meet, and then have the suite of policies and align with that. So the question with our framework is how do we take responsibility as a city for living within our planetary boundaries, following from our strategic direction. And that's the question that, at the city we've done a tremendous amount of work, and there's tons of initiatives and projects in all directions working on environmental sustainability. And how do we integrate that and align that in a strategic direction and answer that question. And another question is, how do we build a city environmental framework and OCP that supports larger goals and objectives? And I think the hope that we have is that this concept of these larger environmental and social goals that we're trying to achieve at a social level, that we can embed that directly into our official community plan with clear targets, so that one, it's clearly communicatable to the outside, to the public, but also that for internally, it provides very clear strategic direction to how we prioritize, all our decisions. And so this is our environmental sustainability framework. And how we're working on trying to understand how that we're taking responsibility for living within our planetary boundaries. I keep thinking my screen is going to move at the same pace of this screen, so I'm looking and reading at different things. So questions that I think that we'd like to reflect and review on in terms of our framework are these. And so does our framework define our strategic focus and give our city a clear vision of what we are working to achieve? Is our framework organized around objectives, and is it aspirational? What should be embedded target indicators that would provide feedback on whether our actions are effective in achieving outcomes? Can our framework serve as a foundation for internal and external messaging, organizing all priorities and initiatives into strategic drivers that ladder up to the higher level goals and purpose? Can our framework provide an externally facing visual outline of activities that make up our organization's overarching strategy, intentions, and show how our actions match our intentions? So what we're hoping is that we can refocus our work plan a little given the timing with the OCP, and we've already been doing this, but to refocus, to review the key categories of our city's environmental responsibility framework and ensure that they are objective-based and capable of capturing local responsibility for key planetary boundaries such as outlined in the Doughnut. So that's really downscaling the Doughnut to our environmental responsibility framework and making sure that it's aligned to meeting these larger environmental goals. The second thing is to review and create environmental targets and key performance indicators that the city can monitor and report on as to evaluate initiative effectiveness. And this work has already begun, and we do have a whole suite of indicators, and I think right now is a really critical time as we're discussing this to be able to go out to the community and be like, hey, these are targets that we feel are important to shoot for as a community to create an environmentally sustainable community. And these targets also mean that there's a whole suite of policy initiatives that have implications. And if we want to shoot for this target, this is what it means. And I think that this is a really important focus that this committee can support in being able to have that community conversation and go out and ask about what are we willing to shoot for and what are we willing to do in order to achieve that. And maybe Rob can speak a little bit more to that later on, about how this committee can support with that. Another question is, and finally, so yeah, that's the process, the committee and reimagine and NIO process and setting key targets embedded in the environmental framework. And then as a focus, and this conversation has already started, seeing that list in the technical briefing, but to identify gaps in key programs and initiatives within the environmental responsibility framework and as being part of what this committee is doing. And the last presentation on that technical report really outlines that. So the recommendations that potentially would like moved to bring to council is one that council, as part of its strategic review process, consider replacing key focus area 1 under the environmental responsibility key focus area with we will take responsibility to build a city and community that operates within the planetary boundaries necessary to maintain core life-sustaining ecological functions. Now, the intent of this recommendation is basically to downscale the planetary boundaries of that Doughnut model to our environmental sustainability framework and how that's embedded in the OCP. The language in this, planetary boundaries and life-sustaining ecological functions probably could work on making it so that it makes sense to everybody. But sort of linking our local efforts to the global efforts in our strategic focus is what that recommendation is about. And then the second one is that the Environment Committee work plan be amended to focus on the development of a holistic, complete, and objectives-based environmental responsibility framework, and that the principles and objectives of the environmental responsibility framework be included in the Reimagine and NIO process. So that concludes what we were hoping to present, and so open up for questions and comments. Jerome.
Thanks. Well, the first thing, I think that's a great idea. I think that, I've personally been struggling with understanding exactly what the framework was, to the point that I wonder what the committee was actually supposed to achieve in the end, or the goal was, and that's never been a very clear thing from start for me. So this sort of proposal of a framework that basically gives a lot of the existing initiatives some sort of place in terms of what they seek to achieve is a great idea. I think that's it's really needed, and I guess my follow-up to that is to say that it seems like the beyond adopting that kind of strategy, I think sorry, there's a lot of noise. I'm by the fire station and they're digging holes. So.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
All right.
The council approved that project.
It's really like Nanaimo needs its own donut. Like, where are we on all those inner and outer circles of the donut, right? And so before you implement it, you kind of have to have at least a preliminary, fairly rapid assessment of where you are, because in some issues, I think the disparities away from the donut are huge, and others are pretty short. So, I mean, I would almost like to see that as a third point, which is, you need a fairly quick preliminary donut assessment for the city if you want to scale it down. So it's one thing to adopt it, and it's one thing to want to integrate it into the Reimagine Nanaimo, but if you want to integrate it into the Reimagine Nanaimo, there has to be a pretty clear idea of exactly where you sit. Otherwise, it doesn't really become a leading sort of approach to the Reimagine process. That's it.
Okay. Any comments or responses to that? Jeremy?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll just jump in too. I think that it's interesting the way all this is coming together, this agenda, and I think it's all timely, and it's just kind of how it's woven together from here. Obviously, the technical background documents, they're starting to speak to some of that, sort of the gaps. Where are we? Where could we be? What does some of this information that we're getting mean, and what decisions do we have to make around that? And then talking about the framework, that's it's a graphical and just a different way of wrapping that up and trying to understand, kind of holistically, graphically, I guess, how all of it ties together. We're talking about through this to the next presentation. Dave will speak to more so how this is going to be integrated, how we're thinking about integrating these things into the Reimagine process, and that's the Community Sustainability Action Plan update is a key piece of the Reimagine process. It already does not, I mean, it's dated, it needs updating, that's why we're doing this, but it does kind of stitch together many of these important policy considerations already. It needs updating. That's what's happening. The timing's great because just to flag that this gives us the opportunity to consider these important matters throughout these large overarching policy documents that are very impactful in the environment, in the fabric of our community, and how we respond, the policies we set, and how we respond to our responsibility going forward. So there's good background information coming together now. There's the start of this discussion about do we have the right framework? How could that be integrated into the Reimagine process? And then Dave's going to be touching on that in more detail. Dave, I don't know if I've captured that accurately, but your presentation will kind of help weave some of this together in a short while here. Just wanted to flag that.
Great.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you coming forward with the high-level framework, which I'm very supportive of, and I'm coming at it from the opposite end, which is action on the ground, and you're quite right. The two need to weave together as we go ahead.
Any other questions, comments?
Lisa, maybe.
Oh, Lisa.
Hi, through the chair, then. I wanted to point out that some of that background work on indicators, while they might not align perfectly with the Doughnut economic indicators, has been done for the city as part of the regional growth strategy targets and indicators work. So the last report was 2019, and typically the RDN tries to do it every year. And there's 22 indicators to measure progress towards the 10 or 11 goals of the regional growth strategy. And of course, the city of Nanaimo is part of the RDN and the regional growth strategy. And so there's some useful baseline information there that we can draw upon that we provide on an annual basis to the RDN when they do their reporting. And so when we're thinking about what we want to use and what's practical to measure, sometimes it's not easy to do it annually. Sometimes some of the indicators require a larger space of time. But just throwing that out there that we're not starting from scratch, and some of that information does exist at the regional level, and I think it's important to look at this within that context. Thanks.
Jerome?
Excuse me?
Oh, sorry, Elise and then Jerome.
Yeah, I'm having a really difficult time hearing the lady speak into the microphone. I can almost not hear her, so I don't know if she's able to speak closer to the head of the microphone or use a different microphone, but it's really difficult to hear her.
Okay.
We're going to fix that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Summarizing just the last comments was basically there are a lot of indicators that do exist in sort of at the regional level. In the regional growth strategy, there's a set of indicators, and so there's linkage with Nanaimo into that, and we're using that currently, those items to inform our plan going forward. So pieces of this are definitely, in place, and expansion. Did that capture what you said?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting, just this question of targets and indicators, and I think like finding the right targets that are encapsulate the vision and the objectives that we're trying to achieve it's an art form and not a simple task in some cases. And then I think that there's a whole infrastructure and resources behind monitoring the indicators and to be able to do that regularly. And I think my feeling is that, if there are gaps, and I think that there definitely is gaps, it's an area that I think that it is worthwhile investment into, and to look at, what would it take? And given that, we're only a municipality of a certain amount of people, we may have to rely on provincial infrastructure and processes for a lot of the data collection and that. But if we knew kind of what the ideal targets were, and what the ideal, if we could have everything and be able to monitor perfectly, what would that look like? And then be able to step back and look at the reality on the ground. Because I think on a whole, in municipalities, I think that is a gap, and in general, just sort of organizational process, it's really valuing how important targets and indicators are for feedback and analysis of progress. And I think that is something in general that would be interesting to have a bit of investigation to look at, as sort of what would it take to get to an idealized spot. And knowing that it may not all come into place before this OCP, obviously, but maybe that's part of the strategic planning going forward, is how can we build a robust monitoring and target system. And it's interesting reading what sort of exists in some other towns. There's this one town in England that's really going forward, and they've got a community dashboard of all these target indicators, and they've got it displayed at the library. You driving into town, the Port Theatre sign has got the indicators on, and it's just this vision is continually being communicated to the community, and it's building that shared purpose. Because if we went around and said with the community what our purpose of, and why are we putting these zoning bylaws in place and building permitting and bike lanes, I don't know how shared of the purpose the community has. And I think that we're up against some serious challenges going forward.
Right.
And as an organization, community people, it's our ability to be responsive and move and adapt. I personally am quite worried about it. I do not think that we're equipped to move quick enough to address some of these things. And we're blessed in Canada having a small population and on the island, and like there's a lot of wiggle room for us, but at the same time it isn't, and we need to demonstrate that it's possible that we can pivot. And if you look at our ability to pivot from 2010 to 2017 in our CO2 emissions, there hasn't been a lot of pivoting, despite quite a lot of effort put in there, and I think it's worthwhile to take seriously and figure out what we do need to put into place, even though we might not currently have the resources to do it all yet, to have an idea of what needs to be done. Any other comments before we move on to the next one? Jerome and Elise.
I just want to speak a bit to what Lisa was saying, and I appreciate that there's a lot of things that have been happening that are keeping on happening when you're carrying through, which is great. There's just a big risk when you do that, and that is that you keep going in the direction you've been going, doing the things you've been doing, and that's great. But it's not going to be a strategy that leads you to change big things. And unless you define those big things up front, then you can carry on doing what you've been doing, but you're not going to get to a place that's going to end up being very different from where you've been going in the first place. So, like, to me, it's so critical that the framework gets defined independently of what you've already been doing, and then have a look at what you have been doing and how does it get you towards your goals. But until those goals are defined, you can entirely bypass the process of establishing your goals and keeping on with business as usual, and not really make, in the end, any sort of significant progress toward what might be some very large overarching goals, the type that are contained within one of these sort of donut diagrams. So I would just caution against just simply saying, well, we've been doing so many things and they already fit, and this is something that we've always said at these meetings. There's so many different components that exist already, and so many of them are interrelated, yet they were never actually articulated around something coherent that frames for every plan that the city owns and develops how those things are interrelated clearly. Maybe they're the people that are into it every day as their part of their job, but for the vast majority of the city, it doesn't exist in a coherent structure for people to know exactly where the actions are leading to. And so Ben's talking about having a big sign on the fourth theater showing emissions and a shared value. Well, that shared value and that shared picture is not developed. It doesn't exist clearly, I think, in the minds of the vast majority of people. So let's not miss the opportunity to define that clearly, and then sort of assess what has been happening and how it fits towards the goals. But with no goal defined, there is no ultimate outcome that gets us, necessarily in a different trajectory, in my mind.
It's Jerome.
Elise.
Elise? Go ahead, Elise. I don't know if I need to shout, but...
Does it make you feel better? I hear you.
In continuation to both Ben and Jerome, I know that there was like a SPY communications committee created, and I'm wondering, because I don't see it in the minutes, if we could have a short little update about how that has been going and if there's been any concrete decisions made.
I can speak to it. No concrete decisions yet. We did have a meeting to talk about developing an engagement strategy for the resiliency strategy, and I've had some back and forth conversations with Lindsay McGunn around questionnaires and kind of an assessment of kind of the state of the environment kind of questionnaire that maybe could be integrated into the Reimagine process. But after chatting with some of the staff at community planning, might be a little late in the day for a high-level questionnaire, but we could maybe do something much more targeted later on. I don't know if Lindsay had anything to add, but maybe not.
Yeah, no, that's right. We had a couple meetings, maybe just one meeting about it. And yeah, we keep going back and forth together over the phone, but it's still important to think about, because even in the donut model, maybe it's supposed to be intermesh, and I should read the person's book, but those seem to be objective things, and what seems to be missing to me is the human dimension, where we understand how the people think about each of those dimensions, as well as what the actual counts are, the actual targets, or the objective data about each of those. So we have to keep in mind there's the actual stuff, and then the perceived side, the psychological side of the community that's supposed to serve as a framework. So I think the communication piece is something in tandem that goes along with all of this, that respects the fact that we're asking people questions about how they think and what they prioritize and what they are scared of and what they're worried about and what they think the city should do in rank order. So while we haven't made any decision, I think it's important to think about the value of it still.
Go ahead, Lisa.
In continuation of that, Rob, you said later on, and obviously it's very important to be conscious with our language, but given that like the plans we are making are so big and require so professionalism and there's a lot of detail, and we like be a little bit more conscious about short-term messaging, even if it's just using social media to ask those questions. Maybe we don't necessarily have the end-all be-all answer, but at least it's getting it in on people's radar. And no, I'm not a psychologist like Lindsay, but it begins those conversations to have the community talking about that, which is going to be very important.
Yeah, it's a good point, but I guess we have been hearing some feedback about the number of questionnaires and the amount of work some people are feeling they're having to do to complete them. So we were mindful of that and wanted to be create something that was perhaps more targeted, that we could use at a later stage when we're looking at the options modeling perhaps. But we don't have a final draft or a product we can show to the committee yet, but that's something that we're looking into, we're thinking about.
So I think
Yeah, not even like a long survey, just short little snippet questions. And they don't necessarily have to be like related to a large project. Just have a conversation, simple as that.
I guess.
Lisa?
Thank you.
Hi, Elise and Lindsay. To build on what you're saying, I think there is opportunity to hold small focus groups with community members to try and get that feedback, if that's one way of doing things, and have those questions. And so I think that if the questions are fleshed out fairly reasonably, it could be a facilitated conversation and a way of really engaging people who might also say, look, here's some of the barriers I have to understanding this. A bit more dialogue than perhaps a questionnaire allows, but still using some of the intent to get that feedback. And I think that could be organized between now and the end of November with your support and help.
That's a good
Yeah.
point, because we are in the middle of working with the parks planner and a transportation planner, and we're doing some scheduling right now with a number of community groups to do basically stakeholder presentations and workshops, and in a fairly succinct way explain the reimagined process, but have some targeted questions around the environment, climate change, parks management, transportation, to try and have a little bit more of a deeper conversation around these and stimulate some input for this early phase of the overall reimagined process. So, good point. It's a good point. So certainly, maybe there's still an opportunity even at this stage to interject some of these questions, and hopefully, build on that later on in the process.
And I guess building on that, I would encourage, and I hope I'm not stepping out of the chair here with the chair, that if there are members of the committee who want to be part of facilitating that conversation with our support, I think that would be helpful if you're interested in putting some time to that and helping pull together the groups. And that can be done via Zoom, or we can look at safe space in one of our rec centers if face-to-face. So I don't want to preempt anything because I realize I'm coming in, but I do think that there's options.
Sure.
Even a group of the right or a sample of 6 to 10 people can be very valuable dialogue compared to a static questionnaire.
Sorry.
What I suggest just on this topic, so we're getting into sort of community messaging and dialogue. on the environment for the OCP process. I think this is a great idea, and I think it'd be wonderful to have the committee members participate in this and look at how we can broach that. Is it possible if we can take this conversation and plunk it after David's presentation?
Sure, of course.
Absolutely.
Just to sort of encapsulate that. Is there any other questions pertaining to framework items? Okay, great. So I think we'll roll on to Jerome. Did you have another question?
Yeah, I do have a quick one. My basic question is, okay, so if you want a framework, who defines the framework? Like who sits down and basically does the first draft of what the framework looks like for this city and what are the big questions you want to ask? If you want to have focus groups and whatever it is, like how do you ask hard questions and who formulates those? Because otherwise, what are they? Like what is it that's going to get us to those questions within that framework?
So I think this is a really good question, and I think that this is sort of the question about, okay, what does it actually look like if we're going to downscale the Doughnut at the municipal level and integrate it into the OCP? Who's actually actioning this, and how is this conversation being initiated, and where is the conversation happening, at what tables? So, Ms. Bopal St. Lisa, did you have
I was going to say, Jerome, that perhaps after Dave and Duncan have spoken,
Sure.
we may actually get some nuggets there that help us with that next step.
Okay, I'm happy to just park that question, but
Yeah, but it's a really good one.
yeah.
Thank you, Jerome. That's definitely top of mind, and I think that we'll pick up that conversation after the presentation here.
Sure.
Okay, David, Mr. Reed.
Hi, I'm attempting to share my screen. I'll just let the moderator let me know if that's back working.
Looks like it's working.
Let me know if he's, okay, cool.
You may need to turn on your current slide button.
There we go.
That's it, good.
Okay, so I'm going to go way too fast, and I know that there's way too much material. I agree with you. You need more than 4 days to take all this in. So the presentation by Duncan and I will really just hit the high points. And so we're going to start with what you've been talking about, this idea of integrating frameworks. I just want to make a few comments. We're going to list several areas of concern, generally, globally, and they also apply to Nanaimo. We're going to overview state-of-the-art precedents, what's being done elsewhere, and wrap that up into some ideas about next steps that might or might not apply for Nanaimo. I'm going to focus mainly on greenhouse gases through Duncan, and then climate change, and then stop for a discussion to get some of your insights and questions. So maybe for the sake of speed, I'll ask you to give us a block of time, and we'll run through this, and then take the questions at the end.
Sounds good.
Okay, Chair?
You tell me when you're ready for questions.
Okay, so, and my apologies for going fast, but I know you've seen the slides, and I know you can read them faster than I can talk. So first I'm looking ahead. I really respect the prior comments at earlier meetings about needs to integrate, and comments to say that just fear of greenhouse gas and climate change isn't going to be enough on its own. We need to integrate that with a whole bunch of other positive objectives. And so in that context, let's go through the Doughnut. I also really enjoy Ms. Rayworth's work, and this Doughnut graphic. It takes a lot of extreme complexity and gets it onto one page. I think as it applies to Nanaimo, everything you said makes sense. I think that if you take each of the social foundations and the ecological ceilings and turn them into broad goals and then Nanaimo-specific objectives, that's a good start, and I support trying to do that. There's a lot of worldwide background to these. But I also say at the same time, to capture everyone in Nanaimo, we need to also turn those into actions on the ground and things that we can measure on the ground in terms of implementation that make sense to the pragmatists among us. I talk about climbing up and down the ladder. We need to go to the high level. We need to go back down to the pragmatic level and keep doing that to keep everybody moving along. This is also from the same source, and it is how they would apply this at a city. I think it's Amsterdam and Portland and Philadelphia are looking at this. So when we go ahead and we start to talk about strategies or groups of strategies, then ideally we will have a set of performance indicators that you mentioned, and we can compare the strategic alternatives to how well they would meet those performance indicators. Some strategies might do really well in one side, social or economic, others better on habitat, say, but we need to communicate with the public and work with them on what their balance of values are. But I wanted to share a couple of others. This is a couple of slides from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choice. They're current as well. And as you know, there's a lot of discussion going on federally and provincially about these issues as well. Maybe there's opportunities for significant both policy support and financial support coming. So the list on the right is things that are maybe coming from senior governments and the marketplace. The chart looks at objectives for thriving Canadians, economic prosperity, and global action. And so you can see when you look at the objectives how much overlap there is between this Canadian approach and the international approach of the Doughnut. It's just mutually supportive. What's common to both of them is that this is not just about greenhouse gases or climate change. It's mixing that with social issues, with economic issues, with, it's very much using all the levers, which is building on the same things that you had discussed earlier. This is also from that same group. And so their point is, if we're talking about climate change mitigation and adaptation, we also need to be talking about growth. And they coined the term clean growth. You're starting to hear that from the federal government. It used to be sustainable growth or others. So the words keep changing, but the intent is the same. But what they're saying is climate change policies need to be integrated with all these other policies, not on their own. So again, supporting what you've been saying. So going from that very high level to the ground and how that might apply to Nanaimo, these three examples are, I call them integrating strategies. There would be high-level goals and objectives and performance indicators that would go with these, but these are examples of how the existing OCP might be adapted to targets for things on the ground, and things on the ground or changes in behavior that you can easily measure. And so when we think about the mobility hubs and mixed-use nodes that are in the existing OCP, I'm curious to draw what an idealized one of those would be. That's, what does it mean in terms of mixed uses? And how would you get to the transit hubs or recreation or culture? I'll give an example. If you thought about Woodgrove or Rutherford, how do you actually get from the neighborhoods around it to Woodgrove on a bicycle? It's not really, there's some links now, but there's lots that aren't there. If Greentown Nurseries gets developed, how do you get from there to the transit hub? Whereas there's some vehicle charging. Is there enough? Is there cycle parking and charging for electric cycles? How much of that do we need? Do we have fully connected walking and cycling networks that are especially implemented within 5 kilometers of those nodes? Because that's the distance that cyclists would typically go. Maybe we also have the longer connections, like along the Parkway or along the Island Highway that link between nodes. And this is odd for environmental, but how do we make those nodes really attractive that you absolutely want to live there? And so that means walk, cycle amenities, weather protection, streetscape, patios, but maybe public art and performance. How do we make them the places to be? Because people living there serves environmental objectives. Now, the other level is what the current OCP calls neighborhoods. How do we make them green and complete? And there's a very good policy foundation. But when I go through the rest of the presentation, you'll see me talking about other municipalities we're working where they are allowing both a primary residence, a secondary suite, and a carriage or lane home all in a small lot. That meets all kinds of social and economic objectives. It also means very high coverage on the lot and a lot less green space. What does that mean for rainwater management, stormwater, and streams? How can we do that and still have the sponge and salt water in? How can we have naturescape at home? Now, the reason I'm talking about the neighborhoods is because they're probably 80% of the land base. So traditionally, we focus on all the higher density, but we don't do much in single-family neighborhoods or in low-rise. But actually, that means we're not addressing most of the watershed. So others are starting to realize, okay, we have to address it there too. How do we increase tree planting in urban forest? There's a lot of that going on in Nanaimo now. How do we support local food practically, and what's appropriate in terms of cycles, walking connections in those broader low-density neighborhoods? And then this last one is integrating social and economic and other objectives. So there's examples in Albuquerque where they talk about another way, and it's also in other places now. How do we create the dignity of work for people that are maybe coming back from homelessness or economic difficulty? And so can we have contract training or nonprofit employment programs, low barrier employment? And certainly we have a need to increase the maintenance of our streetscapes or medians or management of urban interface or wildfire zones or invasive species. We could support community gardens. This is integrating perhaps senior government funding for support and skills training with doing things that are needed in our community to make us more attractive to new residents and tourists. So these are just 3 examples that are meant to do no more than just think about how we make the bridge between these very, very high global objectives down to what you might do in Nanaimo. So I just want to table that, and now we'll get to what's actually in the backgrounders, which that piece wasn't. These are the targets. We'll likely only right now deal with, they're all in the slideshow, but we'll just deal with the first few on climate mitigation and adaptation. When we get to the questions, I want you to be thinking as I go through this, are there other leading successes that you know of other than the ones I mentioned? Are there issues and gaps that apply to Nanaimo that aren't addressed in these papers or this presentation? And are there integrated strategies, other ideas for integrated strategies that could be considered? If you make a mental note of those questions and be thinking about it and jotting discussion points, we'll come back to that. I'm going to let Duncan take us through the highlights of greenhouse gas targets and trends. Duncan, perhaps just tell me next slide, and I'll run through these. Over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to do, again, fairly quickly, a high level of the technical background or the OCP, and just wanted to say that what I've done, and my background is a little bit of introduction, is gone through and tried to summarize the available data, available information, and see what Nanaimo has accomplished in the last 7 to 10 years, and also then to look forward, to look at what the potential of the policies that are coming down the pipeline from the federal and provincial governments are. So I'm going to summarize that at the beginning, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the options. And one of the things that's interesting listening to you guys talk is really trying to understand what your level of comfort you have with how radical you want Nanaimo to be. There's a lot of things, there's some questions there about, whether we're going to look at consumption-based GHG emissions, if we're going to look at things that aren't strictly within the powers of the local government, and how far does Nanaimo want to push? And that's the kind of thing that I think the OCP and this committee might want to think about as we're talking about this. Do we want to just stay strictly within, what the typical level of policies are for local governments in DC, or do we want to look broad at other governments? I pitched this quite conservative in that respect, based on some of the questions I just heard. But there's a spectrum, and different municipalities in DC and around the world have decided to push themselves farther or less. So that to me is the big answer that I'd like to hear in this discussion later on. Okay, next slide. So just to remind everyone what you have committed to, is that in your climate emergency declaration, you guys have committed to a 50 to 57% reduction from 2010 by 2030, and to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions 94 to 107% by 2050. Those are pretty big requirements in 10 years. And just to remind everyone what causes your emissions, your burning of fossil fuels by residents, primarily for gasoline and diesel for your vehicles getting around, and also natural gas and oil for heating and providing hot water to your homes and businesses. As was mentioned by the chair, there's a whole bunch of other emissions that are associated with Nanaimo residents that you can think about in terms of what are the emissions that are currently being produced, let's say in China, that are producing the goods that are being used and consumed, and the food in California that's being shipped up to Nanaimo. I haven't included that in my analysis, and there's I think we could have a 4-hour discussion on why or not. One of the main ones is that the data is just not there in order to actually have a very nuanced discussion about what's actually happening in Nanaimo. There's a lot of academic papers out there. There's a lot of modeling tools. None of them get down to local emissions. So basically, you'd be looking at Canadian-wide data and downscaling it to local conditions based on what's currently out there right now. Next slide. The good news is that Nanaimo actually has fairly aggressive and a fairly complete suite of climate policies. I've worked with municipalities all across BC and across Canada, and I've got to say, you guys already have most of the policies that I would give to many municipalities that are sort of farther behind than you guys. You guys really are pushing the limits of what, not the limits, but you're pushing a very good suite of policies. That there's not a lot that come off on the low-hanging fruit that I would suggest, almost none actually. And so now the question is, how do we turn this up if we want to actually have a chance of meeting those targets without relying on the provincial and federal governments? Excellent. One of the things that is a little depressing is that despite your suite of policies, is that your target and your targets of 33% reduction by 2020, emissions are still rising. I mentioned in the technical report that's largely due to massive increases in the amount of natural gas being burned. This is something we see all across Vancouver Island because natural gas was quite a bit later coming to the island than it was the rest of BC. And so there was a lot of homes were heated and businesses were heated electrically. There's a very low carbon footprint here in BC. But because of the low natural gas prices, we're seeing a fairly large shift over time. And that's really driving the increase. And the other thing to remember is that this is, your targets aren't per capita. They are, so you're doing actually fairly well on a per capita basis compared to other communities on the Central and North Island. But you're growing, which is a good thing and a bad thing. And so the good thing is you've got room and capital investment in order to make change, but you're also, every single person is contributing to more ESG emissions. Next slide. So the modeling that I've done, I'm a data guy, I'm a modeler. What I've done is taken all of the policies that are not the aspirational policies, not the provincial government saying we're going to need to be carbon neutral by 2050, because I've been doing this for a long time and there's been an awful lot of targets set and we don't usually get very far. But I've taken the policies that are actually in legislation or in regulation and started to look at a few exceptions. Some of them are moving that direction, but it's pretty clear they're going to happen, such as the carbon neutral building code by 2032. But this is really taking into account all of the federal and provincial policies and trying to see what it's going to do. And the big one you see is that transportation, given the province's requirements now that all new vehicles by 2040 have to be zero-emission vehicles, primarily electric, but it could be hydrogen by that point, we're not sure. That's going to be really driving our emissions. And we see that the buildings largely start to stop increasing despite a large increase in population. We're using the estimates of population growth that was prepared for you that by 2050 you'll have about 130,000 people, and your building's emissions aren't going up. So that means that we're stopping the emissions, but we're not turning them back down on the building side. Next slide. I can go into all these in great detail, whether offline or online, but I'm trying to highlight here. And so how do we as a community, how does Nanaimo reduce the CO2 emissions? Really, there's only two real approaches. There's increasing efficiency or reducing demand, whether that's by reducing demand in a home by doing better insulation, or by driving fewer kilometers, or by switching to zero carbon energy sources, and that's switching to electricity, switching to hydroelectricity, switching to renewable natural gas, renewable diesel if it's available. But those are really the only two choices. So as we move through all of these things, there's not much else we can do. Next one, fine. And this is just, I can't see the bottom of it. I'm going to roll on the screen so you can see it. And this is a good reminder that the choice of fuel is really important. And we've seen a lot of switch, as I said, from electricity to natural gas, just because of the economics of it in BC. But there's a significant difference in the amount of emissions that are given by different energy on a per gigajoule, on a per unit of energy. So, while yes, moving from heating oil or diesel or gasoline down to natural gas does have an impact, it's not going to get us close to the kinds of targets that your council has set for yourself. We really have to start thinking about, are there other fuels? I haven't included renewable natural gas, which actually is even lower than electricity, BC hydroelectricity in BC, partially because the supply of it is very uncertain, and right now Fortis is producing as much as they possibly can, and we're nowhere close to hitting any targets with it right now. And it's hard to find. We can talk about that if we want to. Next slide. And this was mentioned by the chair. This is a study that was done by the Integral Group that looked at, we've been focused really on efficiency in our buildings in particular. I can go into why we're doing that. I was involved in a lot of these talks at the beginning. But efficiency only gets us so far, and if we're still using natural gas or a hybrid or other fuels, fossil fuels, to heat our buildings, even if they're as efficient as we can make them, and step 5 really is as efficient as we think we can get to, we're still not going to be seeing these substantial decreases in GHG emissions without changing the fuel. Next slide. And another thing that I just want to hit, and maybe this isn't applicable to Nanaimo, but in a lot of other communities around BC, there's a real focus on, well, we need to start investing in solar panels, and we need to start investing in other renewable sources of heat. And yet that's true, especially solar panels, because of the very low carbon nature of our electricity grid. We have a huge advantage in BC that switching to electricity gets us massive 98% reduction very quickly. Yes, we are in an interconnected North American energy grid, and so this is the question is how big a scope you want to be. So one of the arguments is that if we start using more electricity in BC, then Alberta is going to have to start using more fuel, more coal. Other parts of the eastern U.S. Will have to start, can't use our electricity. So it is a big system, but in the scope that the provincial government, the federal government use, our electrical grid is really considered as close to zero emissions as we can get, and we will get less over time. So this is a quick and easy one that we can do. Here in, just to remind everyone that 60% of the buildings that are going to be here in 2050 have already been built. So we really need to focus on our retrofit. We can't build our way out of this building. Next slide. And also just one thing that I think to remember is the lifespans of different urban elements. There's different things that we can do at different time horizons. A water tank lasts for 10 to 12 years. That's something we may want to focus on, although now with our 2030 deadline, we've got to get in there too. But investments in our urban structure and our infrastructure, our street network, last upwards of 50 to 100 years easily. So those are the things, if we're looking at the 2050 time horizon, we might want to start focusing on those now and worry about the hot water tank
in a few years' time if we're trying to kind of meet our target. Next slide. So again, I just listed a bunch of options that are actually somewhat not super aggressive. These are things that other municipalities in BC have done. The biggest one for retrofitting is looking at education, increasing incentives. Right now, Nanaimo has a $350 incentive if you switch from oil or I believe natural gas to a heat pump. Other municipalities, the City of Victoria gives $2,000. The province is now giving up to $6,000 until December 31st. And once we start getting up into those incentives, it becomes a no-brainer for someone to make these choices. Right now, actually up until this $6,000, which was announced in the middle of the election and at zero promotion, it didn't make rational economic sense to not put in a natural gas furnace. With the $6,000, it's probably getting pretty close. If you skip it over a little further, you're going to have enough money to counteract all the advertising that Ford does to convince everyone to go to natural gas. So, we can other new construction and TV side. We can increase the energy technical requirement. We can add a GHG intensity goal, which other municipalities have done in BC. We can start doing density bonusing for zero carbon buildings in construction. So electric vehicles are coming quickly, and we really need to start thinking about what the kinds of infrastructure we need in order to refuel them. Most of your homes, by being low density and single family duplexes, townhouses, are quite easy to retrofit. But a lot of your buildings that are higher density actually have some real challenges, both just from a technical but also from a financial. Retrofitting an existing parking garage can be quite expensive. So do we need to target our charging? Up till now, we put them all at public facilities, targeting kind of people going to destinations, but do we need to have more charging infrastructure near homes that won't be easy to upgrade? Next. Looking at waste. Waste is not a huge under the current definitions of GHG, but it does thrive. And other alternatives, other forms, is there other integrated waste management, gasification waste, so it doesn't decompose in the landfill or in a compost facility, that we can actually capture that as heat or other building facilities. And a big one is active transportation. This is kind of the holy grail, and especially for reducing that 60% of our transportation emissions. The focus right now is at the provincial level is really on electric cars and zero emission vehicles because it's relatively easy. Achieving low, much higher rates of active transportation is difficult, but a very long-term thing. And I think people always talk about Copenhagen and Amsterdam as these targets that we want to, these goals that we want to try to achieve. And we tend to forget that they actually started, they had relatively similar rates of motor split that we do in the 1970s. And they've been working on this for 40 or 50 years in order to achieve the rates of cycling and walking that we kind of aspire to, or a lot of people in our field aspire to. So I really think it's one of the things that we really need to focus on, or we want to look at the long term, but it's not going to get us easily towards the 2030 targets. It might get us somewhere towards 2050 if we start really focusing on it. Next slide. Yeah, that was really quick. Back to David.
So I'll build on that. Thanks very much, Duncan. That was terrific. So I'm doing my part. I repaired new e-bikes at home, but I think that thinking ahead, one of the key things is how do we get the land and the space to have the bicycle connections, and that comes back to, well, what's the role of the city in planning for that, and how do we get that implemented, because developers thinking parcel by parcel. So one of the practical keys. I'm going to really speed through the rest of these. These are about then the impacts of climate change, the other side of the climate change coin from reducing greenhouse gases. Coastal floods, I think all of you likely know that even with the carbon in the atmosphere today, we're looking at maybe a half meter by mid-century and in the range of a meter or more by the end of the century, and then it keeps going 2 meters after that in 2200 or more, and so on. It'll go on for centuries. So Nanaimo has been looking at it, and I'm going to focus on examples. Sorry. So these are some examples. We've done a lot of work in Campbell River, but others have done work in Surrey. Surrey's invested $70 million in adaptation these days. And North Saanich has invested in regulation. I'm going to just show you a few slides from the Campbell River process. So Lake Nanaimo, it has mapped flood construction levels. That is levels allowing for, say, to 2070 or year 2100 that habitable floors of buildings need to be above. So it means you need to build higher if you're going to build in the flood zone. This is Campbell River's downtown. The bad news is that flood zone extends into a big part of it downtown. In Nanaimo, it extends way into Departure Bay, and there is some along the Castle Channel, downtown in Portlands, the estuary, Protection Island. And Nanaimo's it's not all of Nanaimo that's subject to the flood zone, but it is, there are parts of it. This is Campbell River's downtown. This is it today. That's what would happen in the year 2100 with no mitigation in a design storm event. And so not good news. But for Nanaimo, things you could do visualizations like this, like one of these in Departure Bay would be very helpful. You know, where would the water go if you do nothing? This one is actually if you mitigated it. So there are some changes along the water's edge and some lifting of streets and buildings in the back here over the next 100 years that take care of it, but you need to think ahead. The communications around that included a primer on what's the risk, and then a primer on how might we adapt everything from green shores and beach nourishment through living shorelines and dikes and groins and so on. There was an evaluation process, so there was a look at different approaches along the waterfront, and then this is something that I want to talk to you about more as we go ahead. It's a heat map. If you imagine you went through your goals and objectives process and came up with key indicators and targets, then you had, say, 3 different strategies that you were looking at with various factors. You know, some maybe more aggressive than others or more focused on balance between economy and environment. Then your indicators are on this side, and you know what happens with the baseline, no change, and how would the different alternatives rank against those indicators. You might have a couple of pages of this, but this is something that anybody can understand. And the colors are indicating whether you're getting closer to your targets or not, getting better or worse. So it's, again, a graphic summary of a very complex thing. You would have a lot of mathematics behind this. And then you also include things like relative costs, both for capital and operating and so on. But it's something that might be a tool as you go ahead to comparing options, which is what's called phase 2 of the OCP process. And then there was a primer after a public process and a review of options that looked at what is the recommended strategies, what are the priorities, how are they implemented. This is a sample from that, just of interest. This is a simplified section through the downtown. To mitigate, they would build a waterfront walkway that's higher, but they had to elevate the highway. They actually had to elevate the buildings to get up above floodproof because there is this bathtub back in behind that would fill in a big storm, maybe from fresh water. And they need to raise the street. Now here's an example of integration. They'd already planned to redo all their streets to improve their urban design. So the recommendation is, okay, before you do that, raise them a couple of feet. Otherwise you spend millions of dollars and then it would be wasted. And then this is an example of waterfront homes. Right now in Campbell River, there's a lot of some seawall, but mostly a lot of riprap and raised buildings. This looks at their development permit requirements, which would require a green shores and a greater setback to the home, some fill, maybe garages could be below the flood level, but habitable floors are above. There's 2 different styles of homes here. But the idea is that, say this was Protection Island or some of the waterfront homes in Departure Bay, there needs to be environmental objectives met at the same time as flood protection objectives. So this is just a list, and I'm not going to go through reading it all. It lists a lot of the things I just described by example. There might be a retreat in some cases in an island, in places you wouldn't protect, like Departure Bay Creek, but you would have probably a line of defense, some retreat, some way of managing the bathtub behind your line of defense. You'd phase that, but what's immediate actually is how would you get the land? Because you need land to do this, and how do you stop buildings being built today from being at risk? And of course, there is a lot of federal and provincial funding towards this that we want to take advantage of. Next topic is drought management. Yes, please.
Just a process check here. I'm curious, how much more time do you think you're going to need to run through the slides? Just kind of looking at the very in-depth list of different topics. Yeah, I want to check in with you on that.
I think 5 minutes is
okay, perfect.
Before we stop. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no problem there.
I don't want to bury you in all this because I said we'll not get through it all. So 5 minutes to let me give it a stop play. So dealing with longer summers, more drought, more heat, we are going to dry up. So there's a companion study going on to look at additional bulk water supply. The question is when is that going to be needed? And that's related to how much we grow in terms of population, but also how much water we use per person. And price is part of that. So lots of places are looking at tiered water rates, making water more expensive, especially in the drought period. As close as landfill, but certainly Portland, Seattle. And then there's a brochure already with the RDN on irrigation water efficiency or landscape water efficiency. When you look at what size is your water system, it's the peaks. And the peaks are fire flows and summer landscape use. It's not about what you use in your building, it's about what you use outside. So you can do a lot of education on how to design landscapes. This is single family examples that have different areas of water use. They're called hydro zones. You have areas that you plan for high, medium, or low water use, areas that you plan to be unirrigated. This one was for Kelowna. You have a target of 30% less water use in your yard and a calculation tool to calculate that. It's quite simple. Anybody could do it. And then you design your landscape and your irrigation system, if you're going to do that with your watering system, with best practices to meet that budget. So that's targets very much on the ground. I love rainwater capture. This is my trip to Australia, but it's probably a little further down the line because it's a little bit expensive. And so this is about drought management. So there's things that can be done that get at key high water use systems in order to maximize your conservation and perhaps defer in time the additional water supply. That raises a theoretical question. This is stepping up the ladder a bit. You can do a lot with education. I think of a certain amount of regulation as a great educational tool. In other words, you're not really wanting to give people tickets, you're wanting them to pay their attention. And it really is about attention, and it's usually would only do that when you've got, say, 50, 60, 70% of the people conforming, and you're trying to educate the last 10 to 20%. But the key is, right now, I think that I was doing a huge amount of good things, including lots of good things that you've seen in multiple family and commercial development. What's needed, though, because 80% of the land base is single family, is to gradually extend those programs to single family residential, which is a big step. So it's also going to get hotter in the summer, well, hotter year round, but especially in the summer. Not as big an issue in Nanaimo as other places back east, but there are things that can be done to manage urban heat islands. More topical to Nanaimo is interface wildfire, so the forests around us and the big parks. We've seen it in California right now and in BC previously. There was the Sayward fire way back that, enormous fire of Vancouver Island went up one summer. So there is a wildfire management plan. There is talk about managing our forest floor where it's close to urban so that it's not so flammable. So there's a lot that can be done both in private and public management of that. Rainwater management, I could talk about for hours, but basically, how do we get this sponge in our cities as we develop? And so Seattle and Vancouver and lots of municipalities are doing a lot. Nanaimo has done some watershed plans. It's starting to do more. And so Victoria started a stormwater utility, which lets us raise funds and give incentives to build rain gardens and other things. We are seeing a lot of rain gardens in Nanaimo, and again, in these higher density projects, but what about 80% of single family, which is showing this trend, which is going from relatively pervious, spongy areas into a lot of big buildings and pavement, which means we get higher flows into our streams, the streams erode, we get deposition and a lot of habitat damage. So getting these kinds of things also towards single family is something to aspire to. We're working with municipalities on a lot of engineers talking about soils and deep soils, and it's all about the sponge, which is great and new. So this is work for New West and Vancouver on how we might have a coach house and a secondary suite and a big building on a small lot, but still have tree protection and the sponge sufficient to meet, again, very specific targets, numerical targets. This is North Van. It's isometrics of what it requires in single-family duplex. And so Nanaimo's got a start. It could go further in standardizing things in its engineering standards and moving gradually towards the single-family area. And then related to that, there's, again, Nanaimo's done beginning work on sediment control, and as you see the signs around it could rain anytime, like tomorrow. King County and others have gone much, much further. They have lakes, and the lakes get pollutants in them, and the phone rings, and so it's just a matter of, is there next steps for Nanaimo to really stop erosion and sedimentation during construction? Yes.
Sorry to interrupt there. I'm just I'm keeping the eye on the time here, and just we do have a few things for discussion. I'm curious. There's a list of a bunch of different areas of more focus on the adaptation in there. Is it something that we can provide feedback on? Oh, the question's there. Perfect.
Yes, I was just saying that's enough. I was just wrapping up. So that's more time than I expected you could give us, and I appreciate that.
No, it was greatly appreciated. But I'm glad that we've got such an extensive look on things here.
So back to you, Chairman, and these questions, and just open questions from anyone on any of the topics. And I'll wrap by just saying, yes, we expect that this is somewhat overwhelming, and you need time in order to digest it and integrate it with the higher level discussions you were having earlier. So we look forward to how you might come back to us through staff going ahead. So open for questions and discussion.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for that, and I appreciate the broad and extensive look at sort of all the different opportunities that we have to look at. One thing is, for the Environment Committee, is that I would really invite everyone to those questions that are up there. Do you mind leaving those questions up for a second, David?
Sure can. Yeah, I'll put them back.
I really invite the Environment Committee to look at these questions and review the technical briefing that's been provided in the slides. And if you do have any feedback to provide, to send that in, you can CC the chairs and send it to staff so we can pass it on to David. Because the broader breadth of different opportunities that we can look at, the more informed we can be, when we come to the options end of things. So I'll open it up to questions here for a little bit, and then we've got some business that we need to move on. So any questions?
Question.
All right, go ahead, Elise.
David and Duncan, thank you very much. I wish the Environment Committee could have had this presentation when we first came together. I think it's very satisfying to digest, and it gives us a good understanding of what the promises were, where we are at, and where we can go. So I'm very grateful for it, and I wish more people could see this. So I'm glad it is being recorded, and I will be reviewing it afterwards. David, because you were kind of the one mentioning the forest, could you speak to your analysis of the city of Nanaimo, particularly more of the surrounding forested areas, whether they need to stay at present or not?
High level, it raises a question, and when you step back up into the very, very high level, one of the questions when you're thinking about the Doughnut theory is what's the role of the city of Nanaimo versus the region of Nanaimo or the surrounding municipalities versus the province in Canada, because it is a global aspiration. So for instance, one of the roles of Nanaimo perhaps is to densify and to, the people should live in Nanaimo where they're close enough together to use transit and bicycle and walk and so on. And so is it more important for Nanaimo to accommodate those higher density uses in balance with a reasonable amount of forest, or is it important for Nanaimo to actually own more forest? I do think that there's a lot of philosophy around that. I think that the idea of I go up to say, how does Nanaimo and the region manage its forests and its watersheds and its watercourses, because they're all related, that sponge, in a way that meets those global Doughnut Hole objectives, right? Both social and biophysical. I think that's the question, and then there'll be a whole lot of tools. Purchasing land is one, but there's also working with the forest companies and so on and so on and so on. There are a lot of tools that are forms of stewardship. So great question. So I don't think there's a simple answer. I think there's a complex answer. I think it's fair to say how much do we need to protect and what's important to protect. And even the idea of the limits to growth, like, if the growth is to go compact in Nanaimo, then there is a need to have it not be sprawling out all across the region, ideally, which is the regional growth strategy.
Great, thank you. Lisa, did you have something to add on to that?
Yeah, Elise and David. Can you hear me, Elise? Okay, I'll move closer to here. I just wanted to echo very much what Dave was saying. That was spot on. I had a question actually for Duncan, and you don't have to answer it now, but it's that conversation about where we sit with our GHGs vis-a-vis that growth in the regional district. So, for example, if what would be the effect if we did, as Dave said, absorb a greater portion, as we're intended to, of the region's growth in terms of regional GHGs? And I know that's but that's a really important piece for us as part of the OCP and our commitment to the regional growth strategy. So you don't have to answer it now, but Elise and Dave, thank you very much, because that was kind of spot on for some of the pieces the existing OCP aims to do. And it's, again, what do we keep and work towards, even if it hasn't achieved the goals we want yet, and what do we need to change and shift. So anyway, thank you.
Great. Any more questions? I think maybe this is a good moment to circle back to Jerome's question about the frameworks and how we're going to move forward, fitting everything together, and what the process would look like for that. I think one sort of how I'm looking at how OCPs are developed, there's a set of objectives and goals, and then sort of policies streaming from that, and then overarching integrating strategies that sort of are cross-connecting. And I'm just curious, like, if we're trying to go to a model that, if we're looking at a framework that can be externally facing to the community, saying this is what we're doing, this is what we're shooting for, and then also have that same framework be internally organizing so that we can clearly understand sort of our strategic priorities and be able to identify what we need to be working on and organize ourselves from. What is the best process to go forward doing that and trying to like take that big picture view and integrate it down in shift? And am I capturing what your question was there, Jerome?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, yes, I guess you are. You're kind of, I mean, we're talking about integrated strategies, but I think that's the crux of the argument, is that all these big objectives will require completely integrated strategies. If we go down a route of densification and the cities take a hard position on what that means in terms of allowing for sprawl or not allowing for sprawl, then that has implications for how you manage water. It has implications for greenhouse gas emissions, because Duncan didn't speak about things like geothermal, but district geothermal might actually become something viable in the near future if you densify sufficiently and if you plan for it from the start. So this is the key for me, is like how do you actually put down the actual ideas that then become policy, and how all these strategies become integrated later.
Okay.
Go for it, Lisa.
So I'm going to have a crack at this, Jerome, and see where we land. So this is the exciting part. So in terms of right now, we're in the phase where we're looking at technical background information, we're collecting ideas from the community, we're working with committees like yourselves, and after we synthesize this information, I think where you're going is what are we aiming for? We've got, the province has new targets for GHGs that were established in 2018, I think?
Well, and we have climate emergency targets.
That's
now.
right, and so when the OCP was first done, those targets were very different in 2008. So are we as a city going to work with those provincial targets and over what, and measure, and try and achieve them in the time frame set by the province? In all likelihood, yes. And then what comes down to the key pieces is phase 2, where we work with Duncan and Dave and team and model, if we continue on a status quo type of growth, where does that leave us with our GHGs, our water, all the other donut indicators? And the idea is that we have 2 to 3 options of growth scenarios where we accommodate density this way, we have active transportation this way, over this time frame, and what does that lead us to? So that modeling is the exciting piece, and our job with you as the committee members on this team and then other committees is to get feedback on those options and also go back to the community and say, look, here are the options that we have for the next 25, 50, 100 years. And if we change our behaviors or we aspire and direct growth and developers this way, here are the outcomes, and here's how it leads us to better mitigation, adaptation, and all the social indicators. That's where I see this going. And then we are fortunate that we are driving 6 strategies in one through the engagement. And so the trick for us though with the OCP is the official community plan isn't supposed to have every detail. So for example, some of the documents Dave showed us are implementation pieces, and so you keep your OCP so it's striving for that vision, but it doesn't get so detailed that it hamstrings you with innovation down the road. And so that's where you have more flexible implementation plans that you can tweak and adapt every couple of years versus doing an overall OCP review. I'm going to look to Jeremy and Dale, who I've worked with at both the regional district and here, and see if that kind of aligns with what I see happening. And the exciting part of the team that we hired is this capacity to do this modeling and scenarios of, okay, we'll look at neighborhoods this way. If we go with these policies, here's the outcome. If we focus on industrial or multifamily lands, or expand and change, maybe we have less neighborhood. Maybe it gets designated to more multifamily. What does that do to our GHGs and walkability and compact communities? So the exciting stuff is yet to come, but with Duncan and Dave, and chime in guys, because this is how we see this process going.
Hearing silence. Yes, I agree. That's entirely where we see it going. I just reiterate, I think it needs to go ahead at multiple levels. So it needs to go ahead with the global goals and aspirations, and I couldn't agree more. An OCP is a high-level document. It needs to stay high-level, not get into every detail. But I do think in communicating that, this is a communications issue with the general public, it's useful to say, these are our goals and objectives and our targets. Here's ways that can be accomplished. Here's what others have done. It's not just aspirational, it can be done. And in communicating that, to try and capture everyone in the to get over the resistance of, well, that's impossible, or you're going to shut down business, or you're anti-growth. You know, there's all those issues, I think, that have to be addressed at the same time. To me, it's not to be anti-growth. It's about how do we grow. It's about growing differently. It's about different forms of land use and buildings and transportation and incorporation of technology and behavior, all of those things. And I also find it really exciting. You know, it's not a bad news story. It's a very good news story. But I think it needs to be framed in that way.
I just want to jump in. One of the slides I cut out was actually the good news story. I actually think that this is eminently doable from the GHG mitigation, especially because we have BC Hydro. That does help us a lot here in BC. Yeah, there are ways. We're not talking about things that are going to be radically different from your previous OCP. Your previous OCP actually laid the framework for a lot of these goals. And now I think we just need to figure out how to turn them up a little bit, or shift a little bit, or increase the language, and then move on to the implementation plan.
Yeah, we may implement more aggressively. And finally, we've been talking, just likely the OCP, which is high level, there are likely separate action plans, which are much more how are we going to get this done and focus on implementation. But they may not be in the OCP because it's a high level document.
So, it's great. Rob, did you have a comment?
Yeah, the only comment I had was just to recognize what Jerome had also said earlier about, and I guess it's to do with the framework, who asks a question and who kind of accounts for what our targets and limits are, plus what we're going to be focusing on the social level. So I think that's kind of a key kind of element to kind of bring into the conversation too, though, because I didn't quite hear that, how that would happen.
So I guess my thought on that is we would look for guidance on those, like the technical backgrounders that Dave and Duncan have put together. We would look for this committee to provide some guidance around both the goals and the targets and indicators to move us towards that. And there's also something to consider, and I think Duncan alluded to this, that there are some indicators that just aren't there to get us towards the things that we're trying to achieve. So the awareness that, you know, what do we have out there that exists that's still useful, measurable, that we can easily show progress to the community without paying for a full-time position for somebody to go and collect data. What is worthwhile that we still need, that is worth investing in. And then the other piece is that for some indicators to show progress towards our goals, they may be directional versus a hard target, right? And then there's how do you help? So that's where our technical committees like yourselves really help us, because that's a very unwieldy thing to ask the community to get feedback on. So there's ways of doing that, but realistically, it is yourselves as representatives of the community that I think can help us with that piece. And that's where it also ties back into the modeling that Duncan and Leonard will be working with. Duncan and Dave, let me know what your thoughts are around that.
I just, through the chair, I'll add to that. The Doughnut framework is a good one. It's global, but what would be a useful exercise for the Environment Committee would be to go through the various topic areas that are around both the outside of the Doughnut and the inside, the planetary and the social one. And for each of those, and you may have to read a bit of the book, but for each of those say, okay, does this factor apply to the role of the city of Nunn? And how would the city support that goal? And what indicators might be available to the city, targets and indicators to move that forward. I think that would be very useful, and it is a structured way to get your head deeply into that framework. I suspect, I haven't done it myself, and we'd probably be doing it in parallel, but I suspect what you'll find is some of those indicators, maybe half of them will drop away and say that's global, and it's aspirational. We want to be sure that Milan was playing its role in that global indicator, but it's not something the city addresses at higher level. But there are others that the city absolutely, it's in the city's bailiwick, and so it's a sorting and a focusing and a framework that lets you not abandon, absolutely don't abandon the Doughnut framework, but move it into something that is parallel to Amsterdam and Portland. How do we bring that down to the city level?
So, if I could suggest, just with time, I think the actual logistics of how the committee is going to dovetail in with the OCP process and with the environmental framework, that's a conversation that maybe the chairs can have with staff to figure out the mechanics. What I would like is, I think the intent to have those conversations and that to start developing this framework with all these other things going around is something that we do want to do, and I think that the recommendations that were put forward in that presentation capture that and sort of just put some direction behind that for council to ensure that we're following that process. And so maybe if we can bring those recommendations up and have a look at them, Jerome, and if they capture sort of the intent to move that process of downsizing the Doughnut economics into our environmental sustainability framework and then getting the committee to work in this reimagine process to get those targets and frameworks integrated in with the OCP, maybe somebody would be willing to move these recommendations.
Can I ask a question on that topic?
Yeah.
So, in general, I like the idea, and I'm certainly in support of maybe reframing some of it. I'm a little, after what David said, I think there's a lot of good points there in terms of if we want this OCP and this process to basically have an animal's identity in it, we need just to take a bit of time to consider all the different aspects of this donut. And, with 2 minutes of the meeting, I'm not really, I'd rather, can we table this and revisit it, but in the meantime, have some time to actually think it through, and then have a follow-up discussion, even as a committee, to be able to just sort of see how much of the donut actually applies.
Yeah, I think...
If there's not that much, maybe the donut itself can be dropped, but the ideas behind it can be adopted.
Yeah, I think that these motions don't lock us into adopting the Doughnut framework. It really is, the first one really is just looking at a discussion sort of at the council strategic level of changing the language around environmental sustainability, responsibility for tying it into that larger picture. And then also the second motion is really just saying that our work plan is going to shift focus to have these conversations on the framework and work with the OCP process going forward to make sure that those discussions are happening. Yeah, Rob?
I would just add our next scheduled meeting for the committees is November 4th, which is actually not that far away. A deeper conversation around frameworks that kind of follow where you're going, Jerome, can be had then, if we want to do that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. So in terms of moving these right now, your folks' preference would be just to wait to have more conversation next meeting?
That would be my preference, a bit more time to sort of get into the details a little bit more.
Sure.
And the committee today is fairly limited, right? So it would be good to have actually everybody there to have an actual group discussion about it.
Okay. So we'll table this, and the next committee meeting will have a further discussion on the frameworks. The last item was just around Elise brought up around the members of the Environment Committee working with staff and looking at potential engagement opportunities with the community around environmental responsibility objectives. I've got a motion that maybe that we could, a recommendation to get that process moving. So, you know, move that the Environment Committee working group be established to work with staff to develop and provide community engagement around environmental responsibility objectives for the OCP Reimagine process. Does that capture?
I think, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
As long as it's clear that the part of it is the stakeholder, please, the more focused stakeholder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, the motion would just be for you to liaise with committee members and then set up a process for just so that it's documented.
Coordinate together.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So just move that staff will liaise with Environment Committee members to develop focused stakeholder engagement around environmental objectives for the OCP.
Okay, that's good.
We got a seconder?
Is Elise there?
I
Or
don't
did
think
she
she's
leave?
here anymore.
She left?
Seconded, Lisa.
Okay.
Any discussion? Did you have a comment there, Lisa? All in favor? All in favor?
All right.
This is difficult.
Oh yeah, you gotta stop.
Okay, carried. And I believe that is everything. The last thing, just Duncan, you had a question about, you know, to what degree we want to look at the different modeling and how hard do we want to push. And I think that, you know, given the environment, climate declaration, emergency declaration, and unanimous support from council, I think that we definitely would like to see policy options that, you know, are really taking a leadership position on this and doing, you know, and looking at everything possible that we can do to move the dial on adaptation and mitigation, and to have that as an option for the community to look at. So,
I think that's great.
and I think we've hit time. Unless there's any burning comments that need to be made, I'd ask for a motion for adjournment. Moved by Jerome, seconded by Lisa. All in favor? Carried. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thanks.